So who's riding TNCs? What are some of the projects going on? What does this really mean for public agencies? So to start, I'll give you the quick overview of the Shared Use Mobility Center, then I'll go into our research findings, and then I'll talk about the pilots, and out of this study, kind of what our recommendations are for public agencies embarking on pilot projects. So the Shared Use Mobility Center, our mission, which grew out of the car sharing, was to make it possible to live well without having to own your own car by creating a multimodal transportation system that works for all. So it's all about the public interest, and we put transit right at the center, and we saw all these shared modes growing and expanding, and so the idea is to create this integrated system, but to make sure that the benefits accrue back to the cities and communities that they're serving. So in that regard, we got involved with the Transportation Research Board in the US, and we've done a number of studies. The first study really looking at transit and shared mobility and its impacts, and then I'm going to talk about the follow-up study, which we were very fortunate to actually get origin and destination data from the TNCs, from one of the TNCs, which we're not allowed to disclose which one, but you saw them up here on the stage, so it was one of them. You can, I should have one of those polls, and you can tell me what you think it was. But anyway, I'm going to talk about that, and then I wanted to let you know that as part of the Shared Use Mobility Center, we are developing a Mobility on Demand Learning Center. So we already have a policy database that has over 1,000 policies in it about shared mobility and transit, and we're growing that, and we're going to be doing a lot more kind of analytic work with the Learning Center to really highlight case studies and best practices, and by the fall, it should be up in its new form. And then we're providing a lot of technical assistance to cities across the US, mostly through the Federal Transit Administration. And one of the questions was about the MOD sandbox projects. So those are these innovative projects that the Federal Transit Administration in the US is funding. They're combining transit agencies with shared mobility providers. And what we're doing is working with all of those cities, creating learning groups so everybody can learn from each other, benefit from it. And next week, we're going to be announcing with the FTA 6 more cities in the US that are going to have transit agency partnerships with shared mobility providers. But they're going to be working on a year-long business planning effort to get those pilots up. So we're quite immersed in all of these different things. We're working in both larger cities, medium-sized, and rural areas. And there's some very interesting lessons of how to bring in the TNCs and other shared mobility providers in those areas as well. So these partnerships are really growing. The point of this slide is just to show you how it's all happening, and it's not just with the TNCs. And also, I wanted to mention that when I use the term TNC, you think of Uber and Lyft, but we also put, you had Via in that category. And there are some local companies that have sprung up as well. DART in Dallas is kind of creating its own TNC. In Austin, Texas, there was a time when the TNCs weren't allowed there, and there were local companies that came into the forefront. So there are a mix of providers, and there's also other kinds of shared mobility providers as well, like car sharing and bike sharing and microtransit and others. So now to really get into this study, and we were looking at TNCs and transit, And I think that every presenter so far has had a cover of our study. I actually have the cover of the newer version. So this is just out, and we looked at 5 different cities in the US, and we had the origin and destination data for the TNC trips, and we looked at it and overlaid it with transit. The data was very aggregated, so we did have to do quite a bit of work to make sense of it, but we wanted to ask the questions, 2 questions. You know, are the TNCs fundamentally transforming how people are moving around in cities, or is it just a reorganization of the markets for taxis and other for hire transportation? Is it just a substitute, or is something different happening? And then do the recent declines in transit usage, which have occurred in many places, do they represent a real change in how people are getting around? Is this the TNC's fault, or you know, is it symptomatic of other factors? So those were these big questions. We weren't able to fully answer all of that, but we got some insight. And as I mentioned, we had a lot of good data, and we also had survey data. And in some ways, the survey data provided even more insight. So we had 10,000 size survey, and it was distributed primarily by transit agencies. So it was biased in the sense of, you know, it tended to be people who used transit, but some of it was also distributed by the shared mobility providers as well. So it was a mix, and we also had additional survey data from 4 transit agencies that had done their own survey, and we kind of added their findings in as well. So, so what did we find? Well, nothing that should shock you too much, because it's what was being talked about a little while ago, and that is that the TNC usage, weekends and evenings are when it dominates. You know, so it is recreational use, it's going out at night, it's entertainment, it's going to the bars, as John was talking about. But and you know, the peak time, so this is our very geeky, you know, graph that our research director loves to have me use. But you know, if you look inside the red bars, you see the peak on Saturday night, 9 or 10 p.m. And that's not to say that TNCs aren't being used other times as well. In fact, they are. And they definitely are being used during the peak period commute times. But it's interesting the frequency of how they're and when they're being used. So I'll get into that in a few minutes. But the other thing I wanted to point out is that we found that the TNC trips were predominantly short, and in fact less than 3 miles on average. So again, it doesn't mean that's the only thing happening, and it's not, but a lot of short trips being taken around downtowns, often within the same zip code. Big exception to that, airport trips. So in that sense, you have this replacement of taxi rides and maybe an increase in usage of rides to airports. But at the same time, we found that there was usage everywhere. So there was almost every single zip code in the study areas in the 5 cities had rides going on. So the ridership is quite pervasive. But what we find is that people who are transit users or single occupancy vehicle users, their commuting patterns are very regular. They use transit every day, They use their car every day. And what we find with the frequent TNC use is that it's less common than frequent transit use or frequent driving. So the TNCs are one part of the transportation menu. They do fill gaps, but they're rarely the main course. And what this means is in the survey data, people said, I'm running late. I took a TNC. I stayed late at the office. I took it. I wasn't going right home. I was going somewhere else. I took a TNC. So it is filling in those gaps. It is happening during commute hours, and it varies city to city, of course. But you know, unless it's the pooled rides, which is getting into a whole different arena, we were looking at individual rides in TNCs. This is how they're being used. And then we asked in the survey, okay, so why are you doing this? And what does this mean? And here's where we get into what does this mean for transit agencies. It seemed that the top concerns were transit travel and wait times. And so it was those hard to use trips that people are replacing with TNCs. And reliability was also a big concern. And part of that was, at the time, one of the cities in our survey was Washington, D.C. They were in the height of a lot of difficulties with reliability at WMATA, and so the survey results reflected that quite a bit. So we see this as the wake-up call for what we know we need to do anyway in terms of transit to really make it more powerful and better. You know, it's the frequencies, it's the routing, it's really making it as usable as possible is what this points to. And then, as I mentioned, every zip code had usage, and what we're seeing is that while the people using TNCs as a whole tend to be young, you know, more affluent, more educated, it really does cover all income levels at this time. And we're seeing a lot more usage occurring now in older folks as well. So that has been an area that's slowly growing, but it's very pervasive. And there are maps like this for all the cities, and I think, in fact, Bruce is going to show us some of those maps, but it shows that TNC rides are occurring throughout regions. So the big question, what's the impact on vehicle ownership, driving, use of other modes? We don't have definitive results on this topic, but what we can say is that people who use multiple modes, that live in a place where they have access to 3 modes plus transit, you know, the actual multimodal users, they own fewer cars than the people who just use transit. And what we saw was that frequent TNC use and frequent transit use, when those two went together, that people owned fewer cars. When you have somebody who's a single occupancy driver and they're commuting every day in their car, and occasionally they use a TNC, that is not going to have any impact on their car ownership. So transit is still a very central thing, but if we can create these multimodal environments, and the TNCs can be part of that because they give a certain reliability and a backup mode, they can be very effective. And so this is just more on that, the idea that the frequent TNC and transit users report less than 1 household vehicle. So what does all this mean? Well, our first recommendation, our kind of general recommendation for the bigger transit agencies is to address service challenges. So if there's stuff that you can do and you know you need to do, this is the time to do it. And really to look at the partnerships with the TNCs for non-core, for late night service, replace your call and ride, paratransit alternatives, difficult to serve situations. All of these are really ripe for these partnerships and can provide a lot of benefits. And I just, on the screen there, you can see the MBTA pilot, and you can see substantial cost savings that they were able to get in their paratransit service. And primarily this was from shifting to using Lyft and Uber from running their own vehicles in their paratransit. And then low density job access. I think this was talked about a little bit before. We really recommend exploring those first and last mile opportunities, especially in low density suburban areas, because the first last mile can increase your transit ridership if you can get a bigger base of users in those lower density areas. And then also serving markets that aren't being served. So I think there was a little discussion of late night job access. The Pinellas County, which is St. Petersburg, Florida, this pilot has been written about a lot. This was actually providing access for people to get to night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift work, and the transit agency didn't have any service late night, so they set up something where you could take the TNCs to get there, and you could still use transit actually on the way back. And then another recommendation, of course, is about parking reductions. And this, using technology, I think John talked about, now people are actually starting to carpool with this tech. And what this picture is an example. It's a partnership with Scoop, a company that provides an app to carpool to the BART station in the Bay Area. And if you use this app, you get the priority parking and you're guaranteed a parking space. And these are transit stations that fill up very early. And so transit agencies are looking at this model as a way also to even out demand for service, instead of having all those trains so full super early because people go when they can get the parking. They can spread out the demand a little bit in the morning, and it's working really well, and the tech is able to know whether the person is part of the Scoop partnership if they park in the spots. So right-of-way priorities, again, engaging with TNCs on designating curb street space to minimize conflict. This is so important in terms of safety, congestion, and really the use of geofencing, especially for event parking and other places where the app for Lyft and Uber will only work within the geofenced area. So you set aside a certain area for pickup and drop off, and that's the only place it can be, and you shift your parking around. Finally, in another one of our recommendations is the full integration of modes, and a lot of the agencies we're working on are exploring fare integration, co-marketing, and other strategies to encourage multimodalism. And I think it's interesting, with Uber and Lyft having apps, and there are all these other apps, and it's kind of who's going to actually manage the apps and figure out who's going to be on the platform. Because in our experience, there have been issues, in fact, with, between Uber and Lyft, even like wanting the fares displayed side by side. That's a challenging topic for them. So I think this is a very important role that transit agencies can be leaders on is being the coordinator. And it's not that there may be third parties who are building these things, but in making sure that the public interest is served when you put together these apps. The Go Vermont Trip Planner, I put that up there because this is a statewide app, and it's combining, ultimately the plan is to combine human service providers with the public transit providers, and then link it together throughout the entire state so that there aren't the boundaries that you currently have. If someone could actually access any of these rides, regardless of who they are, they may pay a different fare, but that subsidy or lack of subsidy could be built into the app as well, so that you truly can connect up and have a lot more assets benefiting a bigger set of folks. And so finally, my last slide here about pilot project summary recommendations. These are just some things we've been learning from all our work with everyone. You know, some of them are obvious, but setting clear goals is really important up front in these pilots. Think about, you know, is it just going to be about you want to increase utilization, or are you trying to make it something easier, faster, and better for the customer, and how do you balance those things? Know that it will take multiple iterations to make it work. The agencies that have implemented pilots mostly are now implementing new versions of their pilots. So they're learning, trying again, and understand that you might learn how to get the operational flow going, but you might not get very high utilization. If you're doing a first last mile route around one stop and you're running it for 6 months, you can't expect that you're going to have massive buy-in happen on something that's temporary. So thinking about your outreach, your marketing, engaging the community, making sure you're actually solving a problem people have is all important. And then you have to weigh the priorities. So the data sharing issue came up, and I would just say that, you know, in Los Angeles, for example, they were very clear they wanted a certain set of data from the TNC partner in their MOD sandbox project. They weren't able to work that out. They said, okay, we want this data, it's so important. They dropped the partner they had, they found a new partner, and they moved forward. In other situations, and other pilot projects, people said, well, we don't care that much about it. We just want to test out this project. We want to get it going. We'll work out details later. They have projects up and running, and they're able to learn from them. But it's trade-offs. You have to decide what you need and what you can get done. So with that, I will end, and thank you very much. And I look forward to answering questions.